Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents An Heir Comes to Rise by Chloe C. Peñaranda, narrated by Elizabeth Evans. Chapter 1. In Ungardia, not even dreams were safe. In fact, it was the one place humans and Faythe found themselves equal in their vulnerability. To fall asleep was to risk their minds falling to the mercy of the invading Nightwalkers, to be unaware of their chilling presence. Such creatures, or anyone blessed with magic abilities, were born of the immortally supreme Faythe. A dark, invisible force among their ranks, the Nightwalkers possessed the telepathic ability to enter a person's unconscious mind and access their thoughts and memories, allowing them the deadly capacity to kill from within. To Nightwalkers, the mind was a playground of secrets and lies, and it was their eternal delight to release such thoughts from harmless containment and condemn their unwitting host. Everyone has skeletons in the closet, and those who claimed otherwise were usually the ones with the most to hide. Though rare, there were enough uniquely gifted Faythe in Faythe's home kingdom of High Pharaoh that the humans in the impoverished outer town did not revolt against the king, or those living a life of luxury within the high inner city walls. The imperious Faythe cast the humans out, as though they were no more than dogs with the dreary town dwellings as their kennels, where they lived in fear of their immortal superiors. Uprising for equality would be futile and fatal. It was unusual to see the Faythe outside the wall for any reason other than work. There were no sights to behold in the old chipped brown buildings and uneven paths of the outer town, and nothing of interest in the very few amenities. The only regular sightings Faythe was used to were the Faythe guard patrols, though she could never be sure if they stalked the streets to protect the humans or as a further measure to control them. The Faythe saw Faythe's kind as only useful for work, to be exerted until they died undertaking the tasks that kept the city and towns running, cycling on through generations. To an immortal, human lifespans were no more than a slight shift in time. The inner city wasn't completely cut off to Faythe's kind, however. Some of them sought out work behind the fortification for better pay than anything they could get in the outer town. But humans needed unique or sought-after skills to be employed by the Faythe. Faythe had no such skills. Her role was simply that of an assistant to a bustling bakery stall in the main town of Pharaohhold's Market Square. She spent her days making runs from the home where Marie's daughters baked delicious goods to the prime spot on the square, occasionally making personal deliveries too. The pay was miserable, but it was made up for by a couple of breads and pastries she would get to take home each evening. She had never desired to work within the inner city, nor did she envy those who were deemed worthy enough to. She would rather suffer her long, grueling days and petty coin than be constantly looked down upon and forced to work for a pompous, arrogant immortal. Faythe shuddered at the thought of immortality. Why anyone would want to live more than one lifetime in this sad, war-stricken world was beyond her comprehension. She supposed their opulent lifestyle offered more to be desired. Yet the Faythe were an unforgiving, power-hungry people, and despite her fair share of sleeping rough on an empty belly, Faythe was glad she wasn't one of them. This workday was particularly busy. The merciless summer sun beat down, testing Faythe's strength by mid-afternoon. She was slick with sweat and panting, returning with her fourth run of pastries already. Grace says she's out of apples to make any more tarts today. Faythe set down the tray assortment, wiping her brow with the back of her sleeve. Marie huffed her disappointment. Apple tarts were her best seller, and Faythe's favorite. Well, we'll have to make do, I suppose. Marie was a natural with the customers, always cheerful and smiling, which was probably why Faythe was hardly ever asked to work the front. It wasn't that she was unapproachable or hopeless, but Faythe was an open book with her emotions, and that never fared well with clients who were less deserving of Marie's warmth. Marie was also a generous woman and often felt guilty about the small sums she could afford to pay. but Faythe understood. Money was tight for most people in the outer town. A lot of the small trades were stuck in a circular chain reaction. Workers were not able to be paid enough, and as a result, goods had to be sold at a far lower price than they deserved, since no one had much left to spend by the end of each week. "I have a couple of boxes ready for delivery," Marie shouted to the back over the clamor of the midday crowd. Pushing herself up off the crate she'd sat on for a few seconds, Faythe forced down a groan to collect them, her legs and feet starting to ache. Despite being in Marie's employment for 2 years, she never thought it got physically easier. "And be quick. Mrs. Green likes her pies still warm," Marie grumbled, trying to balance multiple tasks of packing and serving at once. With arms full, 4 deliveries to make, Faythe set off down the bustling streets. She knew the winding stone paths of Pharaohhold better than anyone. To prove her point, one evening, her closest friend Jakon had even challenged her to a game of hide-and-seek, blindfolded. Faythe had maneuvered every corner, turn, and discarded crate like a graceful alley cat, and with her other senses forced to be on high alert, it didn't take long to track him down. She considered herself too old for such games now, instead spending her free evenings sparring with Jakon in the square, when trading ceased for the day, leaving it a quiet, ambient space to let loose from their stresses. They could never afford real swords. Jakon worked on the town farm and would steal broom handles to split in 2 every time they whittled the ones they had into twigs. Faythe had been trying to put aside what she could to buy a real blade one day, tired of hearing the thump of wood in place of the singing steel she longed for. But by her calculations, it would take most of a year to save for even a basic model. After weaving her way through crowded streets and making her pleasant but swift stops, she still had 1 delivery left, the Greens' mill. Faythe added a slight skip to her step as she made her way there. It was always a comforting place for her, as her mother had labored for Mrs. Green many years ago. After her death, Faythe would always find solace within the old decrepit building she was dragged along to as a child. Her mother had to fight against Faythe's protests every morning to get her to come along. But it was there she met Reuben, the mill owner's son. The once shy and timid boy with curly blonde hair and dimples became a lively, playful spirit with Faythe's pestering for someone to play with. It wasn't long before she was more reluctant to leave than to go. Once a week, Faythe would look forward to this delivery. Mrs. Green had remained a regular customer of the market stall bakery for years, though Faythe knew it wasn't only the delicious pies that kept her ordering. It was a way for both of them to keep her mother's memory alive. She purposely made her previous stops a little quicker than usual, to have a few minutes spare to spend with Reuben and Mrs. Green. Rounding the corner to the mill, Faythe slowed her brisk pace when the large off-white structure came into view. She almost halted at the sight of a dark, looming figure emerging from the dainty front door. He was cloaked and hooded, an oddity considering the suffocating summer heat. But that wasn't what made Faythe stumble in her tracks. The figure was tall and broad, way too much so to be like any of the men in town. Any human men, at least. Faythe couldn't see this man's ears, to glance their delicate points that would confirm him as Fay, but his stature alone made her think he was of immortal nature. Faythe fought the urge to retreat as he glided toward her. She wanted to avert her eyes, to look at the ground and not pay any attention as he stormed forward. There was no other route to or from the mill without them crossing paths, yet her eyes were fixed, compelled to track him. Her heart became the only sound, pounding loud in her ears in anticipation of the foreboding danger. She'd grown up with an instilled fear of the Fae. Everyone had. He advanced closer, and Faythe tried to catch a glimpse of his face in her curiosity to learn more about the strange male, who held a poise different to any of the patrol she'd seen. He didn't march and stand, intimidating like the others. He was elegant in his movement and inconspicuous in his demeanor. It was clear he didn't want to be noticed. Faythe rarely looked twice at any of the Fae guards who were a regular sight on the streets of Pharaohhold. She found most of them to be carbon copies of the same brute force. But her intrigue was sparked by the mysterious Fae stranger in front of her. She expected him to float past without any acknowledgement of her, as they all did in their ignorance. Then, as he came a foot away, his head tilted upward, eyes locking directly on her. Their emerald color was striking, revealing deeper vibrant hues as he angled his head to the side, and they caught the rays of the sun. Time slowed in that second, or perhaps it was her heart, as the loud thud faded to a distant hum. She thought she saw the same look of inquisition in his own eyes when they narrowed a fraction. Then he passed her completely in one long stride, and Faythe was broken from her trance. She didn't realize she'd stopped walking until she took a long, conscious breath, and her surroundings came into clarity once more. She dared a look back, but the streets behind were empty, and he'd disappeared like a ghost in the wind. When she faced her destination again, realization struck Faythe. What reason would a Fae have for being at the Green's mill? Panic set in, and she pressed forward once again with a hurried pace. Faythe didn't bother knocking as she rushed through the mill door. The aged floorboards cried loudly with every desperate step to locate Reuben and his mother. She couldn't call out for her worry. In the large kitchen, she halted. Her relief at finding them was short-lived when she beheld the desolate look on Mrs. Green's face and noticed her eyes glittering with tears. Reuben had his back to her, but when he turned, his face was ghostly pale. Her heart dropped at his solemn expression in place of his usual quirky smile. None of them spoke for a painfully long moment. When she couldn't stand the suspense any longer, she choked out, "What's wrong?" The pie box in her hands became a heavy weight, and she set it down on the nearby table before taking a step closer to her friend. Reuben opened his mouth to speak, but it moved without any sound, as if he was struggling to comprehend the news. I have to leave," he finally got out in barely more than a whisper. Faythe's frown deepened. "What do you mean? Reuben, what do they want with you?" she asked in urgency. He shook his head. "I'm so sorry, Faythe. I did what I thought I had to. They threatened me in the woods, said they would kill you all if I didn't." He stumbled with ghostly terror. Faythe clenched her trembling fists to hide the betrayal of her fear. She had yet to hear the rest of what had him so horrified. "What did the Fae want?" she pressed again through a shaky breath. His look turned grave. "He was a Nightwalker," he said. Faythe's eyes widened, but she allowed him to go on without interrupting. He came by to warn me, tell me to leave. Before the king has one who isn't so forgiving, bring me in. I've been spying information for Valgard. They cornered me in the dark woods some weeks ago. They asked me to find something, a stone of some kind, apparently hidden within High Pharaoh. I didn't find it. I didn't." Reuben trailed off, acknowledging the foolish and life-threatening act he'd committed. His confession suffocated the air in Faythe's throat and struck her heart into an uneven rhythm. Of all the things she imagined his woes to be, this never even made the list. Faythe had never left her home kingdom of High Pharaoh, but the histories were common knowledge. All children were raised with the lore through stories and song. She and Reuben even had lessons together as children in this very mill about the dangers and threats of the centuries-old war in Ungardia that still remained unresolved. The nefarious kingdom of Valgard, east off the coast of the mainland, had waged conflict on the rest of Ungardia over 500 years ago. The mainland divided its territory between 5 kingdoms: High Pharaoh, Rhinel, Olmstone, Dalrune, and Fenstead, the latter 2 having been finally conquered by Valgard over a century ago during the Great Battles. They had tried and failed to take the former 3, who now held a close alliance. but the overhanging possibility of another great battle made everyone afraid. Faythe's confusion and suspicion piqued, and the emerald eyes of the male outside flashed to mind. It was not often the Fae offered mercy to her kind, and what Reuben spoke of was treason. King Orlon's Silvergriff of High Pharaoh had his Nightwalkers rooting out those accused of such crimes to be sentenced to death immediately. "What are you going to do?" Faythe had no answers, and she didn't expect to receive a useful solution. Though he was a man now, Reuben still held on to his innocence. He was easily led, and his response to fear and pressure had always been to submit rather than fight. As much as Faythe had tried to whack the opposite into him through her brutal pestering to play with weapons and spar as children, it had always been Faythe's idea of fun and Reuben's idea of torture. I don't know, Faythe. I'm scared." At his tone of defeat, something in Faythe awoke, a need to help him in any way she could. She rattled through her mind, trying to think of any possible resolve to save her friend's life. Fleeing would be no easy task. High Pharaoh wasn't the only kingdom with Nightwalkers in their royal service. He could be rooted out in any of the mainland kingdoms for treason. Then one name sang above the rest in dawning: Lake Laria. It was the one mighty kingdom that had remained clear of battles through the centuries. Lake Laria stood as its own great island to the west and was guarded by the wicked Black Sea, commanded by the queen herself, who was rumored to be the oldest ruler in the 7 kingdoms of Ungardia, and the most powerful. Not much was known about the people or lands of Lake Laria. They had closed off their borders long before the conflict started 500 years ago, and only allowed trade routes to remain open. It would be a long shot to get Reuben across the seas and beg for safe entry. It was also perhaps his only hope. They had nothing to fear from Valgard and no reason to search for traitors. As far as anyone knew, no one left that island. Mrs. Green's sob broke through her thoughts. Faythe had almost forgotten the mill owner's presence in her focused concern. Her expression softened at the hopeless look on her usually cheerful, bright face. Faythe said, "I might have an idea." Then she turned her attention to Reuben once more. "Pack what you can carry. Every time you fall asleep, you're at risk. You have to leave tonight. Mrs. Green, you should be safe if you don't know anything." She sobbed hard, and Faythe struggled to hold back her own sadness at the thought of her friend leaving, on the run with his life. Mrs. Green approached her, and she accepted her embrace in solace. Her short, round form fit under Faythe's chin, and she closed her eyes for a moment, as if she could feel herself absorbing the mill owner's pain and grief. When they broke apart, Faythe offered a sad smile. Then she glanced at the clock perched on the wonky mantel behind and swore inwardly. "I have to go," she said. Then she looked once more at Reuben. "I'll meet you by the Westland Forest, 9 o'clock. Reuben nodded. "Thank you, Faythe." She gave a short nod of her own. Then she twisted on her heel and bustled out of the mill before she could crumble under the intense sorrow in the room. Once outdoors, Faythe breathed in deep to calm her storm of emotion. Then she broke into a run back to the square. The day passed by quickly after her rocky encounter at the Greens' mill. Faythe's head rattled with ideas of how she could get Reuben across the sea to his only possible salvation. As anticipated, Marie gave her an earful on how time was money and didn't let her have a moment's rest upon returning. Faythe welcomed the distraction anyway, but all too soon the sun was beginning its descent past the rooftops, and Faythe was heading home for the evening. Well, heading back to what she had come to call home, which was the very small one-bedroom hut she shared with Jakon. Its structure was poor, allowing harsh nights to whistle bitter wind through the cracks of its crooked wooden walls. Despite this, the humble setting brought the odd feeling of warmth and safety. She burst through the threshold and spotted her friend lounging at the bench they used as a dining table in the open kitchen and living area. The place was shoddy and lacking in any color besides hues of brown. Neither of them was particularly bothered about interior design, as they preferred to spend as little time indoors as possible. "Whoa, Marie got you doing marathons again?" Jakon quipped, peering up from the piece of paper he was studying. Faythe gave him a flat look, and he dropped the smirk. "What's wrong?" He set down the parchment and stood immediately. She had to give him credit. He was always quick to detect her mood shifts. Jakon was her closest friend. Older than her by 3 years, he'd saved her from the streets when her mother had died 10 years prior. Faythe had no knowledge of who her father was, leaving her an orphan aged 9. Jakon had already lost his parents to sickness at the same age, so Faythe often thought they were like 2 sides of the same sad coin. "Nothing. I'm handling it." She already knew her friend wouldn't let it go that easily, but she tried anyway to save putting another neck on the line. "Do I have to force it from you?" His mouth set in a thin line, and she knew that cool, calculating look, had butted heads with it many times over the years from his unnecessary overprotectiveness. "You have to trust me on this one. The less minds that know, the better." He frowned deeply, catching on to exactly what she meant. "If you're at risk because of one of those bastards, you'd better tell me now," he growled. There was no arguing with Jakon. They were both as stubborn as each other. Together they were a force to be reckoned with, but against one another it could be cataclysmic. "Can you put your male ego aside and trust I can take care of this?" Faythe snapped. Pushing past him, she grabbed her deep green cloak. The summer nights still held a chill to the air, but she slung the cloak on more for concealment than warmth. Earlier that day, she had snatched some extra bread and pastries without Marie noticing. Finding an old bag, she piled them in to give to Reuben for his journey. Jakon ignored her remark. "Fine, I'll just follow you until I figure it out for myself," he said, reaching for his worn black cloak. She glared at him. "You're insufferable." When he showed no sign of backing off, Faythe huffed, throwing her arms out. "Knowing only puts 2 of us at risk instead of 1. But she knew that if anything were to happen to her, Jakon would be right behind her to accept that fate, too. "It's not even me who's in deep shit. It's Reuben." His expression switched from relief to shock to fear in the 5 minutes it took her to ramble through her short encounter at the mill that morning. "And what exactly is your plan to help him? God's faith, why are you getting involved?" Jakon was pacing, which always set her on edge. "He's our friend. What was I supposed to do? Let him get caught?" she cried. "Damn that boy when I see him for even telling you. He's practically tied his anchor to you as well," he seethed. "He hardly had a choice," Faythe shot back. "You or I would have done the same if the other were threatened the same way." His features softened a little, and he released a long sigh, fastening his cloak. "I would have gotten us the heck out of here before I risked both our necks. He's not safe in any kingdom now." "I have a plan." Jakon curved an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. Faythe shifted on her feet. "Lake Laria." He huffed a humorless laugh. "Right. And your real plan?" "That is my real plan, you asshole. Like you said, no other kingdom is safe. They're neutral territory." "If they let him in." "I didn't say it was an entirely foolproof plan." Jakon rubbed his hands over his face. "There's a ship docked at the harbor for trade tonight," he said reluctantly, offering a solution to the glaring hole in her idea, how to get Reuben across the sea. She perked. "You know this for sure?" He nodded. "I saw it this morning on my way to work." She beamed at the knowledge. "Then let's go." "You don't need to come, Faythe. I'll get Reuben out safely. I know more of the patrol timings than you do." With a dead look, Faythe whirled for the door in response. She slid her hand into her pocket to retrieve the aged brass watch, one of the last items she owned of her mother's. It was nearly 8:30, and dark night had begun to blanket the town. Jakon sighed. "I didn't think so." Chapter 2. Faythe and Jakon crouched low in the dark behind a stack of old discarded wooden pallets, their hoods pulled down to mask their faces. Neither said a word as they waited for the Night Fae patrol to pass. Though they were allowed to be out, they didn't want to risk being stopped for questioning or possibly followed. Any minute now, they would stroll down to the bottom of the intersection by the inn, if Faythe's pocket watch still kept the correct minute. Over the years, she'd had to adjust the handles when the minute hand occasionally stilled. Right on time, they heard the sound of boots scuffling against gravel and faint voices, followed by the appearance of 4 tall, dark figures. Torches lined the sides of the buildings, casting intimidating shadows of their large forms. The Fae soldiers wore uniform colors of deep blue and black, and the sigil of High Pharaoh, a winged griffin, adorned their cloaks, clasped ornately at one shoulder. Royal guards. Even from her position down the street, their size and poise were something Faythe couldn't help but marvel at. She mentally chastised herself every time, but especially now, as she caught Jakon stealing a sideways glance at her obvious interest. For a human, Jakon was handsome. Tall and well-built, his dark brown eyes and permanently disheveled brown hair made him easy on the eyes. The women in town were never subtle in their flirtation. But despite all this, he was still painfully human in comparison. They both were. Faythe's only standout feature was her eyes, her mother's eyes of bright gold. The rest of her was perfectly ordinary. She had chestnut brown hair and was a little too lean thanks to the days she didn't properly feed herself. There was only so much bland broth and stale bread she could stomach. The patrol stopped outside the inn. They made quiet talk among themselves, before a wicked-looking Fae with a scar marring the left side of his face gave a nod and barged through the door with undue force. Faythe flinched at the sound of splintering wood, surprised the door still held on its hinges. They didn't appear to be heading in for an ale and a drunken chat with friends. No, they had business to do with someone inside, likely on the orders of the king. "We have to move now," Jakon whispered beside her. Faythe was rooted, her curiosity getting the better of her. It wasn't often she saw the king's guard taking action in the outer town. It was usually peaceful and boring. Jakon hooked an arm around her elbow. "Now, Faythe," he hissed sternly. She launched into a tiptoed jog behind him, quick but quiet, keeping to the walls for shadow cover. Once around a corner of a street further up, she heard a loud commotion exiting the inn behind her and dared a look back. Faythe held in a small gasp at the sight of a young man being dragged out of the establishment with unnatural ease. His fight would be futile against one of them, let alone the 4 surrounding him. She knew him as Samuel, the innkeeper's son. They weren't friends. He was arrogant and a bully. Regardless of her feelings, she wouldn't wish anyone's fate to be in the hands of the Fae. He thrashed and cried out, but she couldn't make out any words from this distance. The Fae with the scarred face kicked him behind his knees, and Samuel fell with palms splayed to the ground. "We have to go," Jakon insisted, going to grab her elbow again. She pulled her arm out of his reach. "We should help him." The idea sounded just as crazy as when she thought it. Even so, she couldn't stand to leave someone helpless, even someone like Samuel. "Have you lost your mind? There's nothing we can do except earn ourselves a trip to the gallows with him," he hissed. It took all her strength to close her eyes and block out the cries of desperation. Jakon was right. Interfering would only instantly condemn them, too. As she turned her head to walk away, she almost collapsed with the weight of the fear that drowned her. It shocked her as much as it crippled her, because she knew the fear wasn't for herself. She always did have a horrible sense of other people's emotions, and it was a curse she'd learned to live with. As quickly as she felt it, the fear was gone. A sharp chill shot through her body, and she turned on her heel, once again snaking through the shadows like a nighttime bandit. She was still trembling with the ghost of that terror when they reached the edge of the Westland Forest.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?